This is video 16 in a series. To see the rest of the series, please click on the links in the description below. But if a woman has long hair, it is a glory to her, for her hair is given to her for a covering. Some say that this word "for" in verse 15 has been mistranslated from the Greek preposition "anti," and "anti" should really have been translated as "instead of." So in that case, the text would be, "But if a woman has long hair, it is a glory to her, for her hair is given to her instead of a covering." If this is correct, this verse could be taken to mean that long hair is the only covering needed, and that an item of clothing, such as a scarf, hat, or hood, is unnecessary. So what is the correct rendering of this Greek word "anti" in 1 Corinthians 11, verse 15? Does it mean instead, or does it mean for? First of all, I am not a Greek scholar. However, even though I'm not a Greek scholar myself, I can look at the work of people who are Greek scholars and then just use my own common sense. Here is a beginning Greek grammar by Merkel and Plummer. Below each Greek term is given at least one English gloss. That is, a brief English equivalent of the Greek term. Be mindful that an English definition given is merely one of many possible renderings. The more Greek you learn, the more your knowledge of individual vocabulary words will be nuanced. And on page 16, the reader is told that he needs to recognize that all words do have a range of meaning. Here we have the New International Dictionary of New Testament Theology. And here is what these Greek scholars have to say about "anti" in an appendix on prepositions in this dictionary. Since the root sense of "anti" is set over against or opposite, the preposition naturally came to denote equivalence. One object is set over against another as its equivalent. Exchange. One object opposing or distinct from another is given or taken in return for the other. And substitution. One object that is distinguishable from another is given or taken instead of the other. So under this first meaning of equivalence, the Greek scholars who wrote this article say "for" as the equivalent of. Under the lex talionis, Exodus 21, one eye was required as equivalent compensation for another eye. Ophthalmon anti ophthalmu, Matthew 5:38, a tooth for a tooth. In 1 Corinthians 11:15, Paul's point is not that a veil is superfluous for a woman, since nature has given her hair in place of a covering, but rather, arguing analogically, he infers from the general fact that hair has been given to serve as a covering. Anti peribalaiou, not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. That the more generous supply of hair that a woman has when compared with a man shows the appropriateness of her being covered when she prays or prophesies, and so on. So that's what this resource says. And here is a Greek-English lexicon of the New Testament and other early Christian literature. This is the second edition, the Bauer, Gingrich, Danker, and so on. What this lexicon says about auntie is, number one, in order to indicate that one person or thing is or is to be replaced by another, instead of, in place of. Then meaning number two, in order to indicate that one thing is equivalent to another, for, as, in place of. And they list 1 Corinthians 11:15. Koma anti peribolaiou, hair as a covering. And then they also list the eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth in Matthew 5:38. And then they have the third meaning, shows how the meaning in place of, and so on. This is the New Greek-English Interlinear New Testament, published by Tyndale. In Tyndale's Greek Interlinear, auntie is translated as instead of in 1 Corinthians 11:15, because the long hair instead of a covering has been given to her. But in Matthew 5:38, auntie is translated as for, an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth, which does make sense in the context. If you injured someone so that he went blind in one eye, could he say to you, pluck out one of your eyes and give it to me so I can replace the eye you injured? Of course not. The scripture cannot mean instead here. An eye instead of an eye makes no sense. This passage is talking about an equivalent compensation for someone's injury, and it is limiting his vengeance. If you caused him to go blind in one of his eyes, then for him to cause you to lose sight in one of your eyes is equal. It's fair. It's not mercy, of course, but it is simple fairness and justice. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But he's not allowed to blind you in both your eyes, nor to blind your wife and children and all your relatives as well. That would not be an equal or equivalent compensation. So the translators of the Tyndale Interlinear recognize that for is one of the meanings of auntie. But they think instead, rather than for, is the meaning that Paul intended in verse 15 of 1 Corinthians 11. In these 8 translations that I looked at, all except one have the word auntie translated as for or as in both 1 Corinthians 11:15 and in Matthew 5:38. Only Young's literal translation has the word auntie translated as instead of, and it translates auntie in the eye for an eye passage as for. There are more translations on Bible Hub that you can look at as well. So, which Greek scholars are correct and which are incorrect? And how can I, who am not a Greek scholar, decide which of them are right? Well, I need to look at the context of the passage in 1 Corinthians 11, just like I looked at the context in Matthew 5:38. Which meaning of the word makes sense in the passage? First of all, anti is a preposition. A preposition is a word that shows the relationship between two words. So anti shows the relationship between hair and covering. And when I look at the entire context of this passage, I notice that the English word covering has been translated from basically 3 different Greek words. The first time we find the word covering, it is in verse 4, referring to a man's head being covered. The Greek says, every man praying or prophesying kata, which means down over, kephales, his head, ekon, having anything. So every man praying or prophesying, having anything down over his head, shames the head of him. So having anything down over his head. So what might anything be? Well, when I put an object on top of my desk and then lay my long hair on top of it, the object is covered. You can't see what is underneath my hair until I take my hair away to reveal it. And when I put another object on top of my desk and then lay a scarf on top of it, that object is also covered. You can't see the object until I remove the scarf. So, long hair is a covering, and a scarf or a hat or a hood and so on is a covering. They are both coverings. But kata, kephales, ekon, having anything down over his head, does not specify either one. So, if a man had long hair, would his head be covered? Yes. If he wore a headscarf or a hat or a hood, would his head be covered? Yes. When nothing is specified, then anything which meets the general criteria is included. So every man praying or prophesying, having his head covered, dishonors his head. And his head can be covered either by long hair or by a hat or hood or scarf. This scripture does not specify hair. So anything that covers the man's head dishonors his head. So this is the first word for covering in the passage. Every man praying or prophesying, having his head covered, having anything down over his head. And then the second Greek words for covering would be katakalupto. And the third word that's translated as covering, the third Greek word that's translated as covering is peribalaiou. And if you go to BibleHub.com, and look up the Strong's numbers for katakalupto and peripabat. If you go to BibleHub.com and look up these Strong numbers, you can see that the word katakalupto basically means simply to cover or hide. And peribalaion means a covering thrown around, a wrapper. Now the word Peribalayon actually comes from, it's like a compound of peri, which means around, and balo, which means to throw. So it means basically to throw around, like that which is thrown around, like a wrapper or a mantle. And it's interesting that on the back of a box of French hairpins that I have, I noticed that in the instructions on the back, it says this is a classic hairdressing tool and a game changer for throwing your hair in a quick chic bun. Wrap your hair in a high or low bun, and so on. So I think that's interesting. But the main point is that Paul uses the general term cover or covering. He does not specify any particular type of covering. He does not specify the hair. So my common sense tells me that the correct translation of auntie in verse 15 of 1 Corinthians 11 is for. Her hair is given to her for a covering. Next video, how and what does nature teach us?